with another brick in the wall. Welcome back to another edition of the Wake and Aware radio show. This is your host, Infinite Consciousness, commonly known as Jason. Please visit Awake, Aware, and Part of the Solution on Facebook and check out Freedom from Compulsions at www.freedomfromcompulsions.vpweb.com. If you would like to access the archive of all the past Awake and Aware radio shows, please go to www.blogtalkradio.com/infiniteconsciousness. Last week, we discussed the truth about the military and how it is a force being used to push corporate Zionist globalist Rothschild agenda while sacrificing the brainwashed to their gods in the lower vibrational state of fear and horror. This week, we'll be discussing education versus indoctrination. Most parents send their children off to school for many years believing that they are having their children taught knowledge and education in order to expand their minds for the purpose of allowing them to grow intellectually. Unfortunately, there is very little education found in the educational systems today. In today's sick joke of education, children are placed into classrooms and are being told what to believe and, for the most part, to not question the information beyond what the manipulated textbook says is truth. If these children tend to question what they're being told and even do their own homework on the topic at hand, providing an alternative approach or evidence that goes against the constructed norm of information presented, then many times they are considered disruptive, sent to see the school psychologist, diagnosed with some fictitious disorder, and then medicated so they are mind-numbed, in turn no longer questioning what they are told to believe. If, on the other hand, these children take in everything they are taught and then regurgitate it back at the teacher in the form of test answers without leaving the box of what they are told is reality, they then get an A. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not education. This is, by definition, indoctrination. Your children are being indoctrinated into a specific narrow form of thinking that fits the very same system that is manipulating us on all levels. What a brilliant system that not only implants false realities into the belief systems of children and altering perceptions of reality and the self, but one of which takes children away from their loving families for the majority of the day so that the system, which is ran by the government since it has been government subsidized, and in turn ran by the international banking cartel stemming to the Rothschilds and others. Your children are being systematically brainwashed and taken from you for the majority of the day. Keep in mind that the eventual agenda is to terminate all parental rights and have the children raised in government-ran dormitory-type settings. This is part of the totalitarian tiptoe, ladies and gentlemen, and we are getting closer to that point. And once the majority of the children, just like most of the conditioned adults, become indoctrinated into this manipulated school of thought, then they tend to herd each other by condemning and ridiculing anything that goes against their very own conditioning. I think that it should be quite obvious now that education rarely touches the indoctrination centers of the schools and that most true education occurs outside of the walls and tiny box of such a system. Education system or indoctrination system. The following I grabbed from various sources and kind of compiled them together. The development of human civilization is intimately related to the amount of information available at any given time. With the advent of language, humans were enabled to share the information which each of them was personally gathering, and thus the amount of collective information grew. Storytelling, tradition, shamanism, mythology, agricultural tools developed, but there was still a big limitation to the amount of information which a tribe could possess. This hurdle was overcome with the invention of written language and indeed all of the reinvention of ancient civilizations. Sumer, Egypt, Babylon had written languages once we lost our natural higher abilities. This enabled the rulers to establish laws, trade systems, etc., and soon kingdoms and empires mushroomed across the globe. Over time, better mediums of writing down information were invented, and stone or clay tablets were replaced with papyrus, which in turn was later replaced by paper and books. Still, the human hand could only write down so much in a lifetime. During the time in which the church ruled Europe, the Bible was the foundation of all law, yet only the church itself had Bibles, and books were very scarce throughout the population. Many were declared illegal and publicly burned. Things changed dramatically with the invention of the printing press. Not surprisingly, the first book to be printed was the Bible. The flow of information was facilitated so much by the automated printing process that many people could now have a personal Bible, and soon after, Martin Luther said, quote, "A simple layman armed with the scripture is greater than the mightiest pope without it," end quote. What followed was a revolution in which the despotic, monopolistic system of the church was replaced by many autonomous institutions, religious and educational. Humanity's knowledge multiplied progressively and that reflected in the way of life, as it always does. Knowledge rules the mind, and the mind rules over matter. If you want to see a little history into religious origins, look at the show I did in the past on religion through the Blog Talk site. Looking at the situation right now, the vast majority of the humans enter the so-called educational system from the very early ages of 3 or 4, long before their brains and minds have developed. Just like the church, which baptizes children before they have the cognitive abilities to know exactly what is going on. The educational system delivers a massive amount of information into the children's heads so they can fit into this complex society and civilization we have created over the years of accumulation of knowledge. For much of their schooling system are instructed to simply follow what the teacher or textbook says, as they are the sources of authority in the educational process. After many long years in which the students are considered too young and immature to do much independent thinking, at the college level of the U.S. educational system, the students are given assignments in which they are now supposed to analyze on their own. From the definition of the verb to analyze, I understand that an analytical assignment is one in which the writer examines an issue, identifies causes, key factors, and outcomes. Yet, very strict requirements are given, and neglecting them results in a loss of grade. Low grade results in diminished prospects for a successful future for the student, so it is indeed a very severe punishment for straying from the demands of authority. One such requirement, a limitation, is to not make baseless statements while analyzing and back them with, quote, good sources. Immediately another limitation follows. What sources the students can use? They have to be unbiased. They have to be objective. They have to be trusted. Who decides whether they are? Well, the figure of authority of the educational system, of course, the teacher. What are sources considered good? Those coming from universities, colleges, scientific studies, or other generally academic and scientific organizations, also part of the education and the broader scientific community. With this, we instantly enter into the mother of all debates. What is objective truth and what isn't? Many individuals and institutions throughout history have claimed that they are the ones to determine this and have tried to indoctrinate the rest to believe their version of and act according to it. Currently, in the Western world, the mainstream version of what is objective truth is dominated by a bundle of theories united under the umbrella term science, which relies on the centuries-old scientific method. This is just one of the countless methods for interpreting reality and creating a true and untrue, right and wrong type of belief system. What is another such system? One that comes to mind is that of the tyrannical Church of the Dark Ages, which educated people with a secular mindset so often point the finger at when looking for a villain, an outdated power structure which stalled the progress of mankind. To be termed scientific, a method of inquiry must be based on gathering observable, empirical, and measurable evidence subject to scientific principles of reasoning. Ironically, at the time of the formulation of the scientific method, there was no empiric proof of thought, consciousness, and the human mind. They could neither be seen, nor touched, nor heard, nor smelled, nor tasted. There still hasn't been any studies which definitely prove their existence, yet every mentally healthy human knows that they exist, because of their own internal observation and reasoning. It is obvious. Another ironic fact is that science itself is largely based on mathematics and logics, as it was formulated by supporters of Pythagoras, Aristotle, and other ancient Greek and Phoenician thinkers. Pythagoras believed that everything in the universe can be explained through mathematics, and the mathematics is always objective. Right here is an apparent fallacy in the scientific method, because mathematics and logic themselves are entirely based on axioms, which are considered too basic that there can be no empiric proof of them, but direct observation and reasoning are sufficient for humans to know they are true, and the dictionary definition of the word axiom is, quote, self-evident truth, end quote. This tells me that many of the inventors of science themselves believe that a human is capable of just knowing, independent cognition and reasoning, something through direct observation and analyzing independently using his or her rationale. This means that, yes, the first scientists believed that a human is independently capable of reaching objective truth. Science thought it can explain everything through simplification and abstraction. Analysis also implies that it is the analyst who is actively engaged in the process. There are discernment and cognition involved. If one is led to believe that only the conclusions of the scientific studies of academic institutions can be perceived as objective truth, and that any of one's direct experiences, reflections, and rationale are deemed personal, biased, and subjective, then no matter how much one tries, he or she is limited to more or less repeating the conclusions of those academic researchers and is incapable of real active analysis. Repetition, unlike analysis, implies a mechanical process in which there aren't discernment and cognition involved. It doesn't matter whether we paraphrase rather than repeat, because from the definition of the word paraphrase, we learn that it describes an act in which the essence of the message remains the same. It is only the wording which changes. In communication, it is the reception of the essence of the message which counts, not the words which carry it. This means that if a student is required to only think within the boundaries of what scientific and academic sources acknowledge as true, the student is being cornered into a very small fraction of reality. Any analysis which comes out of their will, for sure, be a reflection of the limitation and will only serve the purpose of repeating and reinforcing what already existed before. There will be nothing new in such analysis, and it is a giant waste of time to force millions of students every year to do such an analysis. A student interested in actually learning something new cannot possibly be interested in doing such an analysis. Already enough time, energy, and effort are spent this way. If I were to do such an analysis, it would go against my intellect and personal integrity. Other limitations on the creative and learning process of students are deadlines and length of the assignments. Students are even penalized for writing too much and advised to not pick serious topics because they are harder to fit into the imposed limitations. Furthermore, if a student is persuaded by the educational system that his direct observations and reasoning are not or of no value in an analysis and is penalized with loss of grade for using them as, quote, unproven baseless statements, end quote, this student is being denied any acknowledgement of his or her intellect, free will, and free thought. If an educational system operates in this way, it isn't inviting students to be active participants and learners. It is merely seeking to indoctrinate them and make them conform to a desired pattern of thought and behavior to make them repeaters. This can be nothing but harmful, as it shapes limited, shallow minds in place of the infinite ones which enter the system. As mentioned above, even the early scientists, who were without a doubt progressive, independent thinkers themselves, believed in independent thought and independent observation of objective truth. We can call these observations axioms. These axioms are not opinions and are not subjective because they are the direct result of internal observation of the human mind and reasoning. We can observe the world around us objectively through the five senses externally. We can only objectively observe our mind internally. The argument that everyone's mind is different is void because while it differs somewhat based on the particular conditioning, it always abides by certain principles coming from our genetics. Just like the rest of our being, some of us have blonde hair on top of our heads, some brown, but we all have heads which rest on our necks. All of the healthy humans have 2 legs, 2 arms, 1 head, and all of the healthy humans have a mind which works in the same fundamental ways. By observing one's own mind on a deep enough level, one can learn about the minds of the rest of the healthy humans. Your brain has capacity for direct connection with the outside world. You are not isolated in your personal fairy tale. Remember, we're all interconnected. In the past, to justify its dominion, the church always went back to the Bible and God. He was the creator of all and the absolute truth. He wrote the Bible through the hand of the prophet, and he founded the church through the apostles who herd the flock of sheep from the time of Jesus to the time of apocalypse. As God's representative on earth, the church was then in possession of what is true or false, legal and illegal, moral and immoral. Anything which went against their decree was from the devil and illegal. This meant that any information coming from rival schools of thought was shunned and burned. Believers of such information were also burned publicly for everyone to see. Whether it was pagans, witches, shamans, bogomils, Cathars, Knights Templar, or just scientists like Giordano Bruno, it did not matter. Nowadays, we have the academic establishment which judges what is true and what isn't. It has its own authority figures, and its God is science. The more learned and recognized an academic is, the more letters follow his name, Doctor, MBA, PhD. The more authority he or she has. The educational system evaluates information based on its own beliefs and dogmas. When writing their analytical assignments, students are strongly advised to not use modern information sources like blogs and the biggest and most comprehensive collection of information on earth, Wikipedia. Wikipedia can be altered often, though. It appears that according to the educational system, information coming from the people is not good because anyone could have written it. Quote, It appears that only professional, for hire, followers of the scientific method can be trusted and credible, objective, and truthful. The educational system also goes with its own moral code, like the church did. This is what is known as political correctness, and it is nothing but yet another moral code which tells people what is a correct or appropriate behavior, speech, and thought. Everything which is not politically correct is implied as incorrect. Another form of thought control, ladies and gentlemen. While the object of highest authority changes, the principle stays the same. Today, the advent of the most powerful tool for collecting and sharing information ever, the Internet, has logically brought us the most powerful boom of information, and billions of people can now join their knowledge together and access it from any computer, even a pocket one. The Internet is simply the next level after spoken language. Written language, printed language, it has now allowed to join our minds together in such an efficient way which could have only be beaten if we all once again develop psychic senses and literally join our minds together. This brings to its highest yet level what started with the invention of language, people sharing their knowledge and forming a much larger collective body of knowledge for everyone to benefit from. Like the officials of the church before were adamantly against giving Bibles to their general population, the officials of the educational system today are suspicious of this Internet boom. Students are told to use incomplete and very limited databases which use outdated search algorithms instead of using their critical thinking to evaluate what is good information on the whole of the Internet, which contains the knowledge of hundreds of millions of people and is searchable throughout the most advanced search engines that exist. Why on earth would any teacher do that to poor students? Because those archaic databases are part of the educational system's establishment, and the Internet is not. The Internet is too big to control. Just like the church slandered and shunned everything which it didn't control, now the teachers of the educational system advise against using the vast Internet, which already provides a much broader spectrum of expression than print and has already produced vast cultures which the decaying and outdated educational system cannot even fathom. Yet it keeps pushing its way from the days of old into the minds of millions of students and limits their capacity for thought and hence evolution and process. Keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, they're also talking about tightening up on the Internet and even putting up more firewalls, kind of like in China, because the Internet kind of backfired on them, what they initially wanted to use it for. All right. Is there really a fundamental difference between the church's indoctrination and that of the modern educational system then? The church is simply an older, less informed example of the same strategy of controlling the flow of information and forcefully indoctrinating the vast majority of people. The problem is that when you have a structured, centrally planned system like the church and the educational system, it has to be based on certain principles. Those principles are in turn based on the belief system of the creators and rulers of the establishment and exemplify its limitations. Reality is either infinite or so vast that no human or group of humans have been able to comprehend it at all, and therefore there is no one school of thought which is not ignorant of a vast section of this reality. Furthermore, as long as schools of thought create systems of control of information and indoctrination, there will always be conflict. Different schools of thought will never fully agree with each other, and they are all ignorant of different parts of the reality and take into consideration others. A relativist will always tend to accuse an absolutist of pretending to know it all. An absolutist will always accuse a relativist of going around in circles and beating around the bush. Who's right and who's wrong? Both are right and both are wrong. This can be said about almost all schools of thought out there. They were all based on a fraction of the truth about reality and are ignorant of the rest. Not one school of thought has it all. In this case, does it make sense to create a centrally planned system of education based on one or several of those schools of thought? It will without a doubt cause more ignorance than it actually educates. Because the fraction of reality is focuses on will always be much smaller than the part of reality it is ignorant of. Does it make sense to have a reward-punishment system which promotes the ideals of such a system by giving good grade to those who go by them and penalizes with bad grades and a less successful future those who do not? Does it make sense to standardize the education of all the different students which enter instead of allowing them to grow into unique thinkers independently? Only a formless, shapeless, organically flowing system which takes nothing as dogma and acknowledges everything as a possibility can possibly move with the times without becoming outdated and start slowing down the natural evolution of humankind and causing conflict and oppression. Such a system cannot be centrally planned, and it cannot have authority figures because it will have no original credo to go to justify that authority. A grade system cannot exist because there are no rigid principles to justify what should be rewarded with a good grade and what should be punished with a bad grade. Rules, requirements, guidelines, deadlines, and such cannot possibly exist because there is, once again, nothing to justify them with. In such a system, the new students entering the whole are not treated as inferior or unlearned. They are treated as equal and invited to dialogue so they too can contribute to the progress of the whole. This concept has been called democratic education, among other things. When many hear about it, their first reaction is to say that, with no grade or nothing to strive for, students will simply do nothing and not learn, and education will go to hell. But will it? Famous scientist David Bohm writes in his book On Creativity of an experiment in which chimpanzees were given tools to draw. The chimpanzees immediately started producing drawings very similar to those young children do. The scientist then added the element of a reward-punishment system like education does to children to try to stimulate the chimpanzees into becoming better artists. What happened was the exact opposite. The chimpanzees' ability to create art was completely destroyed. Boom. Another proof that control stifles the brain was found by the Japanese university Gunma. They scanned the brains of 50 people and asked them to describe their relationships with their parents using widely recognized survey method called parental bonding instrument. The study showed that the children of controlling parents have less developed brains than those who had freedom while growing up. New scientist. Because the flow of information has been facilitated so much in the last few decades, the progress of mankind, technological and all other, has been escalating progressively. This means that what was cutting edge just a few years ago is already obsolete. Many older people complain that it is simply impossible to keep up. The old system and many members of the generations which it has produced, no matter how educated they are, have trouble understanding this new level on which information now flows. They are the ones now, no matter how educated, who stand in the way of evolution and progress, like the church did in the past. But evolution is unstoppable, and those who stand in its way are simply done away with. They become obsolete. By the way, I'm not talking about evolution in regards to Darwinism. Darwin was a big Illuminati tool. All right. It is ironic that it is exactly the baby boomer generation which finds itself in this position now, because they themselves rose up when they were young again against the dogmas and limitations of the past during the 60s. All right, public school, government indoctrination system. The public school system is a one-size-fits-all method controlled and mandated by the government bureaucracies. There is very little diversity or alternatives. Parents have very little choice in how their children are educated. Every child must learn the same subjects in the manner prescribed by the government with materials approved by the government to meet government standards in government-selected subjects because that is the rule. How many children wake up today and wish they could stay in bed? They wish that the school bus would not appear this day. They lack desire for school and learning because they are not inspired by the education methods today. Their minds are numbed by the methods mandated in the public schools. For too many students, the school experience is dull and unhappy and full of unintelligible tasks and violations of common sense. Schools should not feel like servitude. Why is it that private schooled and homeschooled children consistently outperform public school children and do so at a cost of half that of public schools? There must be better ways. Shouldn't children wake up with their eyes ablaze, full of life, yearning to head off to school to learn more? Shouldn't the school be filled with teachers that love children and love teaching and love to be there and love to teach? If we could free up education from the rigid block of bureaucratic rules and law, we might just be completely amazed. There must be better ways if only we were allowed the freedom to explore them. Children are innate learning sponges. They have natural curiosity. They want to learn everything. The entire world is a place of wonder and amazement. The greatest learning skill is to have curiosity and to think and analyze the subject. If you can analyze the subject and become curious about it, learning will become easy, fun, and second nature. Learning is natural for children. If a child is not learning in school or does not like school, that is a reflection of the school and education system, not the child. Children wanting to learn is like a water flowing downhill. If it is not happening, there is a problem with the education system. The government indoctrination system fights against innovative and effective schooling. It destroys the successes of innovative, motivational, creative educators like John Taylor Gatto and Jamie Escalante. John Taylor Gatto, who upon finally winning New York State Teacher of the Year award after over 29 years of success, teaching the most at-risk and least promising students, resigned in disgust to fight against the government indoctrination system. Jamie Escalante, subject of the film Stand and Deliver, motivated gang-exposed poor inner-city Latino students to become enthusiastic about calculus of all things. Students who never had any desire or success for the public schools were enthusiastically staying after school, attending Jamie's workshops, having fun participating in math clubs and competitions, and took them from a bottom-failing program to top 10 school in the state of California. All the while, the government indoctrination system was fighting them every step of the way. Their successes were despite the public school system and because of their perseverance in fighting against it. The government indoctrination system works to stifle curiosity, blunt critical analysis and logical reasoning, and instead defer to others with labels of authority. It tramples self-learning, instills conformity, kills self-esteem, and replaces it with self-confidence based on confirmation from others, and produces good little consumer statists who have achieved from their indoctrination nearly zero real-world practical functioning for success. It seems odd that in a society that would laugh at the notion that there is one right car or job or house or hobby or pair of shoes for everyone, the vast majority unquestionably accept that there is one right education for all, that the poetic, dreamy child should be subjected to the same institutions and methods as the outgoing, athletic child, that the brilliant but erratic child should be schooled by the same methods as the dull, plodding child, that the highly motivated, independent child should be squeezed into the institutional structure designed to tame an undisciplined child. We acknowledge some students may be permitted to pursue arts while others are directed into science or physical education. But all must learn in the same manner, within the same authoritarian structure, in the same 15-minute intervals dictated by the same government. We believe it is a virtue if all are held in the same state or national testing standard, rarely asking whether the standard itself measures anything meaningful. State versus the people, page 52, Claire Wolfe and Aaron Zellman, 2004. The system is not improving. If anything, education has become more standardized, more rigid, more controlled than it ever was. With each new bureaucratic reform, the educational expenses become greater and greater without results. Standardized testing, America 2000, Goals 2000, quote, progressive, education, school to work, no child left behind, government monopolized teacher certification. It is an expensive failed attempt at social engineering. With each new reform, parents and communities have less and less say or direction over their children or their own education. A few tidbits of wisdom from, actually, I'm going to skip this piece here regarding this here. All right. Let's see here. I must skip over a piece. All right. Education and indoctrination. This is by R.E. Darby. The fact that these two concepts are and have been traditionally controversial is itself an indication of the confusion our species is in regarding the value of the individual as opposed to that of the organized social group. This is usually couched in the terms of interest of society over those of the individual, bureaucracy or people. The struggle between the needs of society and those of the individual is as old as humans have been social. Like most struggles, there are trade-offs, but what happens when the trade-offs favor the interest of one or more of the other? And what if society's interests become primarily the interest of its bureaucracy or infrastructure? I'm about to be cut off live here, so continue listening, please, and you can go to the website to listen on still. Just plug the title of this article, which is Education or Indoctrination, into any search engine and see what you get. This is a highly controversial subject, but most views miss the point altogether. Almost all the results that we go back from the search engines were based on a specific agenda. For example, one was all about how a particular political organization was trying to impose their own indoctrination on the public school system while failing to acknowledge that state, local, and federal governments, as well as various teachers' unions and associations, have for decades imposed their doctrine on the public school system on a regular basis. Education. What these people seem to be missing is the basic purpose of an educational system in the first place. And in doing so, they fail to identify some fundamental flaws in the current system. For example, like most social infrastructure systems, the educational system has failed to adapt and or adjust to the natural changes of time, and therefore is unable to respond to current needs in an appropriate manner. A small example of this is in the continued requirement for algebra to the extent that without it, a student cannot be past a certain educational point. In the real world, how many citizens ever need to know algebra? with this archaic requirement, it's still being enforced, while at the same time actual critical educational goals such as critical thinking skills, emotional intelligence, or indeed human intelligence is never even discussed. To a free, independently thinking person, this is incredible. Why wouldn't an educational system demand that one of its first educational goals be the mastering of quality thinking skills before the student is exposed to the onslaught of information? Think about it. We send our young to an institution that is run by bureaucrats who are following the instructions of politicians without first arming them with the ability to process information accurately and thereby protect themselves from false assumptions that may be serving a manipulative agenda. Education and politics, and this is, of course, is probably the point. Bureaucrats, politicians are not likely to eagerly embrace real education because that might produce actually aware and intelligent citizens. And that is, and has always been, perceived as a threat to those obsessed with power and control. On the other hand, social indoctrination is likely to produce good, well-behaved, and obedient robots. This is also the root of the overall dilemma. Our educational system has been in place for decades and has indoctrinated generation after generation. Who then will have the thinking skills necessary to generate the appropriate questions that might have the potential for creating the doubt necessary to seek alternative solutions or even innovative thought on these critical subjects? Has anyone ever seen Idiocracy, by the way? It's almost like civilization has been built in catch-22. Society reaches a point in its development where its own survival, is its primary objective, and so must suppress the population in order to achieve that objective. Beyond a certain point of social suppression by means of indoctrination, the population is less and less able to break free of their enslavement and domination. It is difficult, if not impossible, to address a problem that we are not able to be aware of. The solution? Awareness. But we don't see much of that going on these days. There is one small ray of hope, however. There is a growing self-improvement and personal development movement that has at least the potential for waking us up from our cultural trance. This industry is still pretty much in its infancy, but they are pursuing ideas that have solid potential and are worth checking out. All right, dumbing down American education. Now, this goes into something Are USA Kids Smart? This is a reposting of an article by Tom DeWeese, president of the American Policy Center and editor of DeWeese Report. Mr. DeWeese makes a solid argument that there is a deliberate conspiracy on the part of the Department of Education and the National Educational Association, the NEA, to dumb down American education. Along the way, he blasts No Child Left Behind as failing to address the core problems. This article gives an overview of the big picture so clearly that it is hard not to immediately agree with everything he says. In fact, Mr. DeWeese spells out the disaster that our schools have become so well that I can only hope that people, especially parents and taxpayers, will be jolted into action to demand change. The article explains so many things. 20 years ago, the U.S. ranked first in the world in high school diplomas and college degrees. Now our education system ranks 18th out of 24 industrialized nations in effectiveness. We are already second in the world in money spent per student yet. American students grow more illiterate by the year. Okay, I'm going to skip the last little piece of what he was talking about here because there's a big, massive quote in here. But I want to get into something, another article that I grabbed called Dumbing Down. But first I want to read a letter written April 20th, 1994 from a teacher to a parent of a student. Dear Mrs. Blank, you may already know this, but in the case of Alex has neglected to tell you, I am assigning him to detention for 1 hour this Friday, April 22nd. The reason is as follows. Alex consistently defied me. During class, he contradicted me numerous times when I insisted that the length of 1 kilometer was greater than that of 1 mile. Every other student in the class accepted my lesson without argument, but your son refused to believe what I told him, offering such rebuttals as, "You're lying to the class," and commanding other students to challenge my curriculum. Although he was correct, you hear that? Although he was correct, Alex's actions show a blatant disregard for authority and a complete lack of respect for his school. In the future, check this out, in the future, Alex would be better off simply accepting my teachings without resistance. Please see to it that your son understands this. Regards, blank. Now, this is completely insane. You know, this is a teacher admitting that he or she was wrong, but said that the student still should just follow what he or she said. All right, since the advent of progressive education, schools have not been intended to educate, but simply to regiment. Public schooling does not challenge children to learn, to think creatively, but instead indoctrinates them to conform to their prison-like surroundings. What passes for education today, even in our best schools and colleges, is a hopeless anachronism. Sue Fisher, president of the Association of Washington Educators of Talented and Gifted, says that during the past 15 years, the reading level of textbooks has dropped by 2 grade levels. That is, what used to be 3rd grade material is now 5th grade material. In other words, textbooks have been dumbed down. The result, according to a wide-ranging group of including teachers, textbook salesmen, education researchers, and government officials, is a more poorly educated student population. I'm going to skip over this little chunk here because I want to get into something called brainwashing and mind control techniques. This is used in any type of mind control program, which stemmed a lot of it from the MK Ultra programs from Nazi Germany that the CIA started using in the United States, and in all the different indoctrination systems that are in this nation, including rehabilitation centers, programs, residential centers, school systems, religious institutions, all this kind of stuff. So let's look at this article here. It's called Brainwashing and Mind Control Techniques. The term brainwashing came into common language through the work of American journalist Edward Hunter, who was an expert on Oriental issues. The very word being the direct translation of Chinese hisi-neo, I know I'm saying that wrong. The Chinese meant certain techniques in dealing with adversaries and or training of officials. To the Western usage of the term brainwashing spread to the 1950s through several publications depicting the treatment of American soldiers at Chinese prison camp during the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. Below, and this is in the article, is a list of the usual brainwashing mind control techniques used in schools, hospitals, army, religious cults, totalitarian states, with political prisoners and dissidents, mentally insane, some versions of psychotherapy, etc., etc. Indoctrination is a more slight and more subliminal form of brainwashing. Example, commercials. However, these concepts are nothing short of controversial and open to various interpretations, which should be kept in mind while pursuing the web sources below. Judging by the extremely diverse material on the subject found from the net, the funny thing about the term brainwashing itself is that it can be handily appropriated by just anyone, whether they were right-wing or left-wing, religious people or anti-cultists, to support the claims of their opponents. Supposedly using these brainwashing techniques, being miserable, no good wretches, so on and so forth. I became not a little bit cynical after wallowing through tons of web pages by religious bigots, downright wackos. This is from the author. So let's look at some of these things. 1. Hypnosis. Inducing a high state of suggestibility, often thinly disguised as relaxation and meditation. Repetitive music, most likely with a beat close to the human heart, 45 to 72 beats per minute. Most likely used during study sessions, as the teacher will say the music helps you relax and concentrate better. Voice recall. A voice roll is a pattern-paced style used by hypnotists when inducing a trance. It is also used by many lawyers, several of whom are highly trained hypnotists, when they desire to entrench a point firmly in the minds of the jurors. A voice roll can sound as if the speaker were talking to a beat of a metronome, or it may sound as though he were emphasizing every word in a monotonous pattern style. Think about newscasters, ladies and gentlemen. This word, by the way, a lot of newscasters are trained in hypnotherapy, or hypnotism. The words will usually be delivered at the rate of 45 to 60 beats per minute, maximizing the hypnotic effect. Room feel. The way a room feels is essential to hypnotizing unknowing subjects. It needs special lighting. Fluorescent lights are best because they aren't too dim but aren't too harsh. And by the way, fluorescent lights work on a specific pulse pattern that affect brainwave activity that brings it to the state of hypnosis, kind of like television and computer screens do. Also, room temperature helps a bit. Usually a little cooler than normal room temperature. You need to have the unknowing subjects very relaxed, perhaps even close to falling asleep. Okay, 2, peer pressure. Suppressing doubt and resistance to new ideas by exploiting the need to belong. 3, love bombing, creating a sense of family through physical touch, thought, and feeling, sharing and emotional bonding. 4, rejection of old values, accelerating acceptance of new lifestyle by constantly denouncing former beliefs and values. 5, confusing doctrine, encouraging blind acceptance and rejections of logic through complex lectures on an incomprehensible doctrine. 6, metacommunication, implanting subliminal messages by stressing certain key words or phrases in long, confusing lectures. 7. Removal of privacy, achieving loss of ability to evaluate logically by preventing private contemplation. 8. Disinhibition, encouraging childlike obedience by orchestrating childlike behavior. 9. Uncompromising rules, inducing regression and disorientation by soliciting agreement to seemingly simple rules which regulate meal times, bathroom breaks, and use of medications. 10. Verbal abuse, desensitizing through bombardment with foul and abusive language. Physical abuse, such as torture, in the most extreme form of this. All right, 11. Sleep deprivation and fatigue, creating disorientation and vulnerability by prolonging mental and physical activity and withholding adequate rest and sleep. 12. Dress codes, removing individuality by demanding conformity to the group dress code. 13. Chanting or singing, eliminating non-cult ideas through group repetition of mind-narrowing chants and phrases. 14. Confession, encouraging the destruction of the individual ego through confession of personal weaknesses and innermost feelings of doubt. 15. Financial commitment, achieving increased dependence on the group by burning bridges to the past through the donation of assets. 16. Finger pointing, creating a false sense of righteousness by pointing to the shortcomings of the outside world. 17. Isolation, inducing loss of reality by physical separation from family, friends, society, and rational references. 18. Controlled approval, maintaining vulnerability and confusion by alternately rewarding and punishing similar actions. 19. Change of diet, creating disorientation and increased susceptibility to emotional arousal by depriving the nervous system of necessary nutrients through the use of specific diets and or fasting. Also applying drugs for these purposes fall in this category. 20. Games, inducing dependence on the group by introducing games with obscure rules. 21. No questions, accomplishing automatic acceptance of beliefs by discouraging questions. 22. Guilt, reinforcing the need for salvation by exaggerating the sins of the former lifestyles. 23. Fear, maintaining loyalty and obedience to the group by threatening soul, life, or limb for the slightest negative thought, word, or deed. All right, 3 principles of re-education. Let's look at this quickly. Repetition, going through the same subject over and over again until it is known by heart. 2. Activity pedagogics, excuse for that mispronunciation. The subjects are never left alone nor give any private time of their own. They are always in activity. 3. Criticism and self-criticism. The subjects are supposed to feel uncertain under the constant threat of being humiliated and despised. In the Korean War, the criticism and self-criticism sessions held for the American prisoners of war by the Chinese clearly held deeper effects than the POWs could initially comprehend. And when they found out, it was too late. In the beginning, many prisoners found this whole procedure just childish and were inclined to take it merely as something of a joke. But without them being able to realize it, the situation of being subjected constantly to the criticism of one's commands, or comrades rather, became humiliating. That a grown-up person should publicly discuss one's habits or inclinations, some of them of very private nature, confess one's faults, receive strong criticism for insignificant misdemeanors will not be indeed the course of time anything to be considered childish or playful. We only got 30 seconds here. Basically, our children are being indoctrinated, ladies and gentlemen, and it's so easy to see. If you just look at American history, it's the biggest joke I've ever seen in my entire life. Any free thought, anything that alters from what they are being told to believe is considered wrong, is considered dangerous, is considered going against the norm. A lot of times these kids are sent to the psychologist, like I said in the beginning, diagnosed with a fictitious disorder where you need to reorder called ADHD, when really they have a lot of energy